When you hear about Africa, you may imagine deserts, wildlife, and long coastlines. Hardly anyone pictures steel hulls cutting through Atlantic nights, stalking convoys, turning supply routes into graveyards. Yet during World War II, South African waters became a hunting ground where warships rewrote the rules of survival at sea. These ships didn't chase glory. They chased silhouettes. And you are about to see every Africa's deadliest World War II warships, the true convoy killers, who they were, how they fought, and why their shadows still stretch across history. So stay with us until the end. HMSAS Natal funny. How some ships arrive quietly, then immediately write their name into war history. Almost immediately after fitting out in Scotland, she was thrown into Atlantic patrols where convoy routes still felt like open wounds. Within hours of becoming operational, Natal took part in the destruction of a German U-boat, and proving she wasn't built for escort duty alone, but for ending shadows that stalked merchant lines. HMSAS Natal entered service in March 1945 as a Loch-class frigate, freshly converted for one job only: hunting submarines. No ceremonial easing into duty. Her design focused heavily on anti-submarine warfare. Depth charges, sonar, and endurance mattered more than speed. From there, she continued escort and patrol work before later being sent east for Far Eastern operations as the war dragged on. Natal never chased prestige routes. She lived in shipping lanes where radio static, dark water, and explosions decided who made it home. That first kill followed her like a ghost signature, proof that even a newborn ship could become a convoy executioner. HMSAS Good Hope. HMSAS Good Hope, transferred to South African control in 1944, belonged to that kind of war. Also a Loch-class frigate, she stepped into escort service when U-boats still prowled shipping corridors, especially across the South Atlantic. Her days were built around protection, guarding merchant convoys, scanning waters for periscopes, dropping depth charges into empty-looking seas that were rarely empty. By 1945, she was fully absorbed into patrol and escort operations, operating as a moving shield for supply lines that could not afford another loss. After the guns fell silent, Good Hope's role shifted again. Instead of explosives and sonar pings, she carried soldiers home, becoming part of the massive repatriation effort after the war. That contrast is what makes her story unsettling. The same hull that once stalked unseen enemies through black water later crossed those same routes, carrying men who had survived it. Few ships wore both purposes so closely. HMSAS. Transvaal timing can decide whether a ship becomes a legend or remains a quiet weapon. She never saw the brutal peak years of the convoy slaughter, but her purpose was shaped entirely by them. Transvaal was built around anti-submarine doctrine, training crews in sonar work, depth charge runs, escort formation discipline, and the exact routines used to protect convoys from sudden underwater attacks. While major engagements were fewer, her decks became classrooms of war. HMSAS Transvaal, originally built as HMS Loch Ard, arrived late, transferred in 1944, completed as the war was already bending toward its end. Sailors learned how U-boats hunted, how wolf packs tracked, or how false silences often meant death waiting. She served across Atlantic escort routes and continued in service beyond the war, helping preserve the tactics that had finally broken Germany's grip on shipping lanes. Transvaal's darkness isn't in how many ships she fought, but in what she prepared others to face. She was a factory of survival methods. HMSAS Sonnebloem. If you were standing on a South African pier in 1943, you wouldn't have guessed Sonnebloem would become a warship. She began life as a civilian whaler, thick-hulled, slow, built for cold seas and heavy nets, not combat. War rewrote her purpose. Converted under Royal Navy control, Sonnebloem was armed, reinforced, and sent into escort and patrol work across South African convoy routes and into the Indian Ocean. Her assignments were built around the fear that German submarines were sliding further south, creeping toward ports once considered safe. She patrolled shipping corridors, guarded harbor approaches, and moved with convoys that could not defend themselves. Her smaller size didn't make her harmless. It made her perfect for coastal tracking, listening work, and sudden responses. Sonnebloem lived in the margins of the war: mines, submarines, and lone merchant vessels. She didn't need headlines. Every uneventful voyage meant another convoy didn't vanish without explanation. HMSAS Immortel's story begins far from the idea of a deadly ship. She too was born as a working trawler, though designed to pull life from the sea, not protect it. Then came her conversion: steel plates, weapon mounts, listening equipment, and suddenly Immortel was sweeping mines, escorting convoys, and running anti-submarine patrols around South African waters. Her role lived in the hidden dangers: mines that floated half-submerged, torpedoes launched from nowhere, submarines that followed for days before striking. Immortel spent the war moving through those invisible threats, clearing paths so cargo ships could risk the crossing. She wasn't fast. She wasn't large. She was persistent. Her operations stitched together ports, supply routes, and fuel corridors that the wider Allied war effort depended on. Immortel didn't sink enemy fleets. She erased the traps they left behind. And sometimes, in convoy war, removing the unseen weapon mattered more than firing your own. HMSAS Pretoria. Let me explain this one the way it really felt. Where Pretoria didn't arrive with a reputation. She arrived with urgency. Built among the earliest South African Naval Forces vessels and quickly placed under Royal Navy control, her war started in a hurry. Escort duty came first. Convoys didn't wait. Routes between the Cape Sea lanes and the Indian Ocean were already turning dangerous, and Pretoria was pushed straight into them. Some days meant guarding fuel carriers sliding past Table Bay. Other weeks pulled her far eastward, were riding patrol arcs where shipping traffic thinned and submarine rumors thickened. Her job wasn't glory, it was continuity. Keep the corridor open, keep cargo moving, keep wreckage from becoming routine. Pretoria became a moving hinge between oceans, a ship constantly repositioned where Allied logistics were weakest. She didn't specialize in dramatic engagements. She specialized in preventing absence, making sure ships arrived instead of disappearing. In a convoy war, that quiet success often mattered more than confirmed kills. HMSAS Standerton. There's a reason Standerton's name shows up again and again in escort records. She started as a trawler, never designed to face war, then got stripped, reinforced, and reshaped into a convoy escort vessel. That change dropped her into one of the most uncomfortable waters of the conflict, the Mozambique Channel. German U-boats learned quickly that Allied traffic funneled through that stretch, and they followed it like hunters following a trail. Standerton became part of the moving screen that tried to break that pattern. Her days were built on spacing, sonar checks, sudden course changes, and long watches where nothing happened until everything happened. She guarded merchant ships, circled them, peeled away to investigate echoes, then rushed back before the formation cracked open. Anti-submarine duty defined her service. Not heroic charges, grinding vigilance. In those waters, my survival wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. And Standerton lived inside that tension. HMSAS Oddberg never pretended to be something larger than she was. She was a small armed vessel, and her battlefield wasn't open ocean. It was the uneasy space near harbors. The ports looked calm. They never were. Mines drifted. Torpedoes waited. Oddberg's war unfolded close to shore, where merchant ships slowed, gathered, and became perfect targets. Her assignments primarily involved minesweeping and screening merchant traffic, clearing paths through waters seeded with hidden explosives. She worked the approaches, the exits, the quiet zones where explosions felt most unnatural. Axis forces didn't need fleets there. A single submerged charge could shut down an entire port rhythm. Oddberg's job was to stop that from happening. She crept. She listened. She cut through suspected mine lines and watched over ships that could barely defend themselves. Oddberg's war wasn't loud. It was surgical. And one missed threat could erase months of shipping effort in seconds. HMSAS Cedarburg. Did you know she belonged to the group of makeshift anti-submarine craft that filled the gaps when South Africa had almost nothing at sea? Her bleak hull, modest armament, no illusions. Yet those humble vessels became the spine of convoy survival across the southern oceans. Cedarburg's world stretched across long crossings where the horizon never changed and help was never close. She escorted merchant ships through waters that German raiders and submarines increasingly probed, acting as both guard and warning system. Her value came from presence, from routine, from being there when something surfaced that shouldn't have. She didn't dominate seas. She inhabited them. Days bled into nights. Convoys pressed forward. Cedarburg held position, listening, watching, reacting. In the war's quieter theaters, ships like hers kept commerce breathing. Without them, the southern routes would have collapsed into isolated, undefended corridors. Well, now let's talk about HMSAS Turfontaine. Turfontaine lived in the hours most people forget. After sunset, before sunrise. She began as a coastal vessel and then became a converted escort tasked with guarding South African port approaches. Her service leaned heavily into night work, stealthy watches, slow patrols, sonar sweeps rolling beneath black water. These weren't distant operations. She worked close to home waters, where ports fed the Allied war effort, and any successful strike would echo immediately. Turfontaine patrolled, screened, doubled back, and traced invisible grids across familiar coastlines that had quietly turned hostile. Submarines didn't need deep oceans anymore. They slipped near harbors. That's where Turfontaine stood. She wasn't chasing fleets. She was denying access. Every uneventful patrol meant another night without fire on the horizon. Another convoy is loading instead of burning. Her war was measured in silence maintained. HMSAS. Vereniging. Vereniging worked in the space where nerves lived. She wasn't designed for spectacle. She was designed for prevention. As a minehunter and convoy shepherd, her days were built around two threats that rarely announced themselves: floating death and underwater silence. Mines drifted where tides carried them. U-boats moved where patrols thinned. Vereniging existed between those dangers. One moment, She was sweeping suspected mine zones, feeling her way through waters that could erupt without warning. Next, she was riding convoy edges, circling slow merchant ships, watching for patterns that didn't belong. German wolf packs had already shown they were willing to push south, testing routes once considered distant from the war. Vereniging's role became a constant question. What's hiding here today? Her war wasn't about chasing targets. It was about denying them space. Every cleared passage meant trade survived another week. Every convoy she guided through southern waters bent the odds away from disappearance. MV Treern didn't start under an African sun. She was built in Norway. I shaped for cold seas, then pulled into a wider war that would drag her far from home. Converted into a minesweeper, Treern entered the Mediterranean theater and served there from 1942 to 1944, where shipping lanes were laced with explosive traps meant to starve Allied supply chains. Her work was brutally simple and brutally dangerous. Locate mines, neutralize them, move forward. Again and again. Ports depended on it. Fuel depended on it. Armies depended on it. Treern, T-94. Sweeps opened corridors through fields designed to close the war down piece by piece. While submarines hunted in the deep, mines quietly waited where ships had no room to maneuver. Treern's contribution wasn't dramatic. It was essential. By clearing those hidden weapons, she kept Allied logistics breathing, convoy by convoy, across one of the most mined seas of the war. MV Paul was on Paul 1, T-512 came from a whaler's life, not a military one. Thick hull, working decks, built to endure, not to fight. War rewired her purpose. Requisitioned and converted, she became a minesweeper and coastal patrol vessel, assigned to South African waters where traffic clustered around Natal and the Cape approaches. Those routes were arteries. Everything passed through them. Fuel, food, equipment, troops. Paulwine worked those edges, harbor mouths, coastal lanes, approach corridors, places where mines were most effective and merchant ships most exposed. Her patrols blended sweeping operations with constant surveillance. Clear the water, guard the movement, repeat. She didn't roam oceans. She guarded doorways, and doorways mattered. A single undetected mine could freeze an entire port rhythm. Paulwine's war lived in that fragile balance between flow and shutdown. Each safe passage meant the coastline stayed connected to the wider war. Escort trawlers fleet. This is where the real backbone lived. Before South Africa ever received larger frigates, nearly 80 trawlers and whalers were pulled from civilian life and reshaped into escort and minesweeping vessels. Not one or two, dozens. They formed the core of early South African naval power. These ships weren't built for combat. They were adapted for survival. Anti-submarine patrols, convoy escort, mine clearance, harbor defense. Southern shipping lanes depended on them. Long before polished warships arrived, these converted hulls stood between merchant traffic and silent annihilation. They operated across vast southern crossings where rescue was unlikely, and detection came late. Crews worked on older engines, limited weapons, and improvised systems, yet they became a constant presence along routes that German submarines increasingly tested. This fleet didn't produce iconic single-ship legends. It produced continuity. Without these trawlers and whalers, South Africa's sea war would have collapsed before it ever stabilized. So South Africans on Royal Navy capital ships. Not every South African sea story flew a South African flag. Thousands of South African sailors served aboard Royal Navy destroyers and cruisers, embedding into Britain's naval war wherever the fighting burned hottest. Some of the heaviest losses came far from home waters. Ships like HMS Dorsetshire and HMS Cornwall carried South Africans into the Indian Ocean, where Japanese carrier aircraft would later tear through Allied fleets. When those ships were attacked and sunk, South Africans went down with them. Airstrikes replaced torpedoes. Steel decks became firestorms. Survival meant open water and burning oil. These weren't SANF hulls, but they were South African lives, operating major warships, guarding convoys, hunting raiders, then suddenly facing skies filled with incoming aircraft. Their role reminds us of something darker. South Africa's naval war didn't stay local. It followed its sailors across oceans, into battles where entire crews vanished in minutes. And that's where this journey through South Africa's wartime seas comes to rest. Quiet ships, borrowed hulls, relentless watches. Together, they guarded routes the world depended on. If you like this video, then press the subscribe button because more videos like this are waiting for you. Thanks for watching and being with us.